when Peter, and you'll have to remind me how to pronounce the word again, Peter. Peter is going to talk to us about sympoiesis, is how the best word I can lift from your description. Peter, you'd like to introduce your own subject, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's see what we can do with all this tech. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Pleasure to be here. I think that set it up rather well, Angus, although you know, we will see how the discussion develops, but I think yes, it set things up really rather well, and I found that your talk extremely useful. What I'm talking about now is Donna Haraway's Chthulucene, easier to pronounce than it looks. And the way I'm going to talk you through this is in the manner of an exploration. I'm not pretending to be the world's expert on her work here, but I will certainly be working to go some way to correct that, to develop more knowledge as we go through. What I want to say at the beginning is, you know, when John kindly asked me to make a presentation here, I thought about it, and I thought about, in a sense, a kind of home run piece on technology, altered a little bit for cybernetics, or some recollection I had of early involvement in cybernetics or something like that. But in the end, I decided that now is the time for the brave, and now is the time to do some of the thinking that I always wanted to do in a kind of university setting and so on and so forth, which was to grapple with the big stuff. And that's what made me decide to go with Donna Haraway's work. And, you know, I also think, frankly, we, the Cybernetics Society, are not the society for the safe. We're here to discuss big ideas, and I think what I'm trying to do is commend this idea to you, not necessarily sell it in its entirety, but to commend her work to you. Also, at the beginning, I would just say that I want to put some warnings out there, because I don't want to you know, in the short time we have available, fall into sort of obvious traps, or what might be obvious traps, and maybe you won't necessarily thank me for these, but I want to just make some very basic points about Donna Haraway's work, which is, number one, it's not anti-technological. She is not anti-technological. She is opposed to kind of two gods. One is the god of techno fixes, and one is the god of the kind of techno apocalypse. She's trying to find our way through those positions. And you know, I think so. Let's not, because she's talking a lot about ecology and so on and so forth, and she's trying to reject the Anthropocene, as we'll see as we go through. Let's not then fall into the trap of thinking that she goes all the way to, in a sense, a technological rejection. Not at all, as I'll explain later. So it's not a pastoral kind of thesis of kind of pure landscapes and pure animals and nasty men. It's not that kind of position at all. Rather, what we see with Donna Haraway's work and the idea of the Chthulucene is about the difficulty and yet the meaning and the beauty of coming together with other living things, each other, members of the Cybernetics Society, our families, our work colleagues, people who interrupt us whilst we're walking on the street, but also, you know, the neighborhood dog, the neighborhood cat, the insects that occupy our garden. And it's, in a sense, it's about this, the difficulty, but yet the meaning of all these relationships, and in a sense, a kind of beauty of them, but and making that a kind of primary source of how we see life. So it is something to do with an epistemic shift, So I mentioned also at the beginning that in some of her talks, recorded talks, Haraway cites cybernetics approvingly. She mentions it kind of in passing, doesn't make a big thing about it, but talks about finding cybernetics useful. And she does cite some of the authors that would be known here, in particular in relation to psychology, Gregory Bateson. So that's the intro. And now we fight on. So in terms of some content, and we'll time myself so I don't, you know, I'm not still talking when you've all gone for hot chocolate and to bed. What I'm going to do is introduce the Chthulucene, her concepts of the Chthulucene, going to position that against a kind of central message which she has, which is staying with the trouble. There's a kind of central, a kind of a motif for understanding the epistemic shift that we're trying to get to. And then the concept of sympoiesis, autopoiesis, not modified and not corrected, but embraced within an idea of sympoiesis. I think I will make that more obvious and more clear by talking about how she uses the idea of plantations. If we're still in time and still going, then we'll move to some of her kind of thinking, advice about thinking. And this, she has this all the time, this kind of lovely use of language, obviously seriously interested in using language to provoke us into new ways of thinking. And she has this, you know, many lovely phrases and ways of kind of dropping in messages in the beauty of a kind of near literary kind of quality. And she has this idea of it matters, she says, it matters what worlds. And that's one of the things that attracted me to her work very greatly, because I'm honored to see Vanilla here today, because I had a chat with your father about some of this too many years ago, but he was trying to teach me in a way in which I didn't understand with my clunky, I wish I could say it was a clunky teenage brain, but I was probably like 31 or something. It was something like that. And he was trying to teach me about the dangers of disciplinary thinking. And I remember that conversation. And as I got into Donna Haraway's work, Stafford's advice to me was echoing through my brain. So this is where we are with the Chthulucene. All art is Geraldine Javier, except where I've stolen from Getty. But I noted that. So to start off then, not to be too simple, we understand the idea of the Anthropocene, and in the works there's a kind of an early acknowledgement of the Anthropocene and an accreditation of this that goes to the work of Eugene Stormer and then Paul Crutzen, one a freshwater biologist, one an atmospheric researcher, and how from kind of water and sky, the concept of the Anthropocene, that the human being has changed, you know, has become a material event in the kind of history of the planet, such that its actions are now controlling destinies. So that term comes in to explain that. And researching this, I was surprised that the term wasn't older, because it's accredited really to the 1980s, but as a kind of concept. So the concept of the Anthropocene, and Haraway is not trying to replace the Anthropocene with the Chthulucene. She's not saying, at least she's not saying there's going to be a switch, but what she's trying to advocate is a kind of a growth of a Chthulucene, of a kind of Chthulucene type thinking, such that it might one day be a kind of a replacement for how human beings think of themselves and the planet, and therefore become a kind of a modification or replacement to the Anthropocene. But what I'm trying to say there, a little bit clunkily, is that this is not a kind of a stage shift. This is a migration of ideas, such that an Anthropocene is replaced by the Chthulucene. She also highlights what she calls the Capitalocene, which is really, you know, I'm a Mancunian by birth, and so it's my fault, because it comes from the 18th century in the northwest of England, and this almost kind of hyper-aggressive structure of capital acquisition. When we industrialize this process, when we manage to to parcel off the land, when we offended William Blake, and when we put John Clare out to ruin, and so on and so forth, then the Chthulucene is this exponential shift in our abilities to in a sense operate an Anthropocene. We become the master industrialists of the Anthropocene with the Industrial Revolution. And so she uses this term as well to kind of highlight our later history. And again, she's trying to see the Chthulucene grow alongside and develop and replace. So the Chthulucene itself, and I'm quoting from her, is the Chthulucene is a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble. A kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying on a damaged earth. This is an ongoing multi-species story a combination of stories and practices of becoming with important terms, of becoming with in times that remain at stake, in precarious times in which the sky has not yet fallen. This is a kind of imaginative way of us making us think about a kind of new way of seeing, but she's describing the Chthulucene as a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying on a damaged earth. And perhaps you also notice the highlight of a multi-species world. She's saying human beings within the world. So instead of human beings, in a sense, acquiring the world as an Anthropocene, or even more aggressively, a Chthulucene, now human beings within the world, and the human beings become, in a sense, they subject themselves to the biotic and abiotic processes of the ecology, and therefore acknowledge a new relation with what is around them. She calls this a future of tentacular relations. Tentacular or tentacularity, tentacles. This is reaching into and becoming involved in one another's world. We are affected by and we affect all those that we come into encounters with. And that's not just all us, that's all sentient existence. We are affected by and we affect all others through these relations. The word tentacular comes from tentacle, of course, which comes from the Latin tentare, to feel. Tentare, to feel. So an emotional relation to do with the connection, the stretching out and the finding of this emotional relation is thereby conducted, engaged in. Always an emotional relation with the connection, whether that be a kind of social human to human connection, or into that relation with the neighborhood cat, or in our decisions about the nest of ants in the garden, and so on. This future of tentacular relations, not only first order, but further on beyond, because we don't know, but we can maybe appreciate that if we chase off the cat, or if we remove the nest of ants and so on and so forth, it has some further effects. This sits really well, I think, with variety, which we all know, the concepts of variety, because I think fundamentally she's trying to store us up to think about and appreciate a higher variety ecology, in a sense that to try and see variety creation in some way, a kind of a beneficial variety equation as our duty as living beings. Sits very well, I think, with what Angus was saying before, because in a sense this kind of moral purpose then becomes to bring ourselves into some sort of ecological relation that has a kind of moral probity about it, by virtue of us knowing the science behind it. All the time the emphasis is on becoming with. You are not alone, you are never alone, you never were alone. You are becoming with. Your identity is a constant kind of becoming with. So when I come to the kind of central message, I think this idea, I think this is really where we kind of gain hold of a raft on the river of her thinking. This idea of staying with the trouble. She's basically saying to me, she's saying to you, she's saying to everyone, and this is a little bit my own telling of it, a little bit my own distillation, but she's saying we could start with domesticity, for example. She's saying, you know, those chores that you have, and the, you know, the difficulties of maybe some household relations, and building kin with the neighbours and the people about you, and so on and so forth. Well, actually, that's the center of your life, she's saying. You know, that's the building kin, the building those relations, looking after household, looking after the garden, building, you know, all of those kind of relations. That's the center of your life, and it's trouble, but stay with the trouble. You know, that's what she's saying. It's trouble. Stay with the trouble, because that's where your meaning is, and that's what you're good at. That's what you're equipped to do. You're good at making all of those decisions, those kind of, again, taking the prompt from Angus, kind of agency decisions. And so you could start and unpack what she means by this just by thinking about domesticity. But you could also go to the level of the planet, which is where she naturally homes herself, and just to say, well, what the trouble of inheriting a damaged planet, how do we respond to that trouble of inheriting a damaged planet, a planet that needs our help? And again, this is staying with the trouble. Well, you don't leave it, you don't give up, you don't believe in a techno fix, nor a techno apocalypse. You stay with the trouble and you work it out. And this is you in your tentacular relation to the planet, to Earth, to kin. And in that tentacular relation, you are finding meaning, and that's how you begin to, you know, in a sense, rebuild and reconstruct. So it is in this trouble, and not in our accumulation of assets, a point I'm going to come to in a moment, but it's in this trouble that we become. And here we are, all of us, in our domesticity of kin and the damaged planet, and we're all becoming. And our judgments in relation to it are what positions us, each other, and indeed the planet for the future. So if I come now to sympoiesis, Maturana and Varela, of course, the concept of autopoiesis, this kind of process of self-reproduction. And Stafford's, I think it was Stafford originally, his great, you know, clever contribution around pathological autopoiesis. And I've sat through a day of committee meetings at the university. I've seen some of that today. But sympoiesis, so what's she saying here? So Maturana and Varela, they position autopoiesis as this process of self-reproduction. In other words, something comes into being by a fixed set of relations, a process of self-reproduction. To my understanding, you know, humility clause, but to my understanding, what she's saying with sympoiesis is that self-reproduction is not alone, but that process, any autopoietic process, is interacting and intersected by, but interacting in various ways with other autopoietic processes. And these interactions themselves are varied and may have emergent effects. So I would say what she's saying rather carefully is that sympoiesis enfolds autopoiesis. No element owns the process in which it exists, and no self drives it. So I think what she's trying to do is alter our level of thinking and about the relations in which we are manifest, to say they are ultimately sympoietic. You know, the honeybee seeks out the pollen from the flower, and you know, and in that there might be an autopoietic relationship, but that relationship is then fixed in other relationships around the flower, around the honeybee, around the bacteria, around what nests around the bee's nest, and so on and so forth. And these are all interacting with each other, and that's where she's trying to drive us to, I think, with sympoiesis. So a few more points, hopefully make it clear. So we sit then in a kind of a world where we are all the time never alone. None of us ever, never alone. There is always something, something living is with us. And she uses the term, the critters, and so on and so forth. The critters, what are the critters? Well, we're all critters. All of us, all living beings, we're all critters, high variety. This is extremely high variety. This is trying to understand life as this kind of highest variety set of multitudinous equations. So the critters, the kin, and our making of kin becomes central to how we understand our contributions to life, making kin. We live on this injured and wounded planet, but we choose to stay with the trouble. And we're becoming with all the time, our microbiome, for example, we are inhabited by living microbiota and so on. Our houses, our neighborhoods, the energy sources, plant life, in a sense, it's all a kind of set of kin relations that we're trying to conduct into some sort of harmonious, optimal kind of position. But it's not easy, and it's difficult, and there are compromises and trials, tears, tribulations, doubt along the way. To make it to put another kind of lens on it, the idea of a plantation becomes useful. Here's my Getty image, and the plantation here as this kind of slave colony is offensive, but it wasn't always. The frightening thing is that it wasn't always. Here was a collection of assets to some eyes, and she tries to alert us to this. And the horror of owning other people may have been obliterated or reduced and so on over time, but our basic inclination to build the plantation, she argues, is still with us. We are still seeing the world fundamentally as assets for our own usage. So this also, though rid of the horror of owning people, this also is a plantation. You see a hint of the ecological variety on the hillsides, but what we see is in front of us is not some natural field, but is a massively reduced variety equation, an ecology now made sparse for the purposes of agricultural production. It's difficult. We need to eat. She's never saying these things are easy, but let's see it. Think about the huge plains. Ian Kendrick is here, and I remember him very memorably once telling me about taking the plane east coast to west coast of the United States and seeing underneath farm after farm after farm after farm after farm after farm, all of them with this kind of reduced variety, all of them with this reduced ecology designed to keep out the critters, to reduce the critters, to make them into useful plantations of a sort related to a kind of human production. Once I began to see what she was saying about plantations, I began to see them everywhere. Actually, in a sense, how we've organized the world basically on a kind of resource type model. So we come to kind of a final few points, but as she's trying to alert people to think about these things, she cites Virginia Woolf, and she goes, think we must. Think we must. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds. Think we must. Think about the episteme to which you are belonging. Think about in a sense, the relationship that you have with your own thinking and what you have inherited, knowing and not knowing, what you have drawn down about how you understand the world. Are you some sort of dominant entity building reservoir after reservoir of asset, or are you somehow part of the world in some on some other kind of basis? And here I switch a little bit, but you know, I again note the kind of beauty of what she's saying, the beauty of the language. It matters what stories tell stories. It matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what worlds worlds. And in order to try and help us think in a more complex way, well, we're not all cyberneticians, so or the whole world isn't full of cyberneticians. So she kind of uses some sort of what I might call a little bit clumsily epistemic kind of tools, and her favorite one is what she calls SFs, SF. And what she's doing there is she's relating from multiple different perspectives the a kind of single problem. So she used centrally to the SF is the idea of the string figure, SF, string figure, which is to say we're not in some flowchart relations. We're trying to build string figures, much more complex tentacular relations, and understand the world as a kind of set of in a sense, through the idea of our thinking should be tumbling through, building these string figures, seeing relation upon relation, some sort of shape, but ultimately, the world is not going to fit into an organizational chart, is not a set of boxes, is not a set of categories. It's something more elaborate, and just moving towards the idea of the string figure becomes a way of kind of prompting a richer thinking. So string figures, again, SF is a kind of epistemic tool that she's using. She's talking also about science fact, science fiction. Her book, Staying with the Trouble, ends with science fiction, speculative fabulation, storytelling, and speculative feminism, and so far, seeing us so far, understanding all of this as process. So, she's trying to enrich the thinking, trying to understand the thinking, where it comes from. And when I encountered this, I remembered sitting, I think it was a pub garden it was definitely Winchester. And I remember somehow by some magic, I ended up alone with Stafford Beer after he was lecturing and so on and so forth with everyone at King Alfred's College, where he was teaching at that stage. And he had with him, so there were three of us, he had with him a PhD student, and I think she was from Swansea, and I have tried to look her up since, but failed to find her. But he was telling me at that stage about his concern about the disciplinarity or the curriculum in schools. And I remember not fully understanding or not fully being able to grasp, but to work with the idea that he seemed to be saying to me that to teach history separately from mathematics, for example, could be problematic, in the sense that we are, and I think where he was reaching to, and his PhD student was a teacher, where he was reaching to was that we needed a richer base of thinking. We needed a higher variety mind to meet the higher variety problems in which the world was, as he thought, and correctly so, I think, tumbling at that stage. It must have been 1996, something like that. I'm not really sure, but it's the same game that Donna Haraway is playing, in the sense that where she's talking about worlds. We have to think about what's our epistemology, but also, in a sense, what do we know and what do we fundamentally express about some sort of problem set, about some kind of way of knowing, and will enriching that help us to come to very different sets of ideas and in a sense, relations. I say relations rather than solutions, relations with the world, than a set of assumptions and a set of ways of thinking and ways of practicing that we don't question and we don't seek to build. Right, I'm probably done for time now. I think by way of kind of ending it, I think I think it's there to be treated seriously and to be discussed in a way. It's an idea I kind of commend, or a set of ideas I commend to you in that way, to be digested, maybe torn out a little bit. Maybe your understanding is greater than mine. It will certainly be of some aspects of it, but it, I encountered it, and as I turned the pages of the book and I'd heard her talk about cybernetics, I was thinking, yeah, we're here. Cybernetics is here, and that's why I decided on this topic. Thank you.
Peter, brilliant. Thank you very much. We'll all do the clapping